So once again, good morning. We're continuing. We did not complete last week's Mishnah, so maybe that's good news. That means there's a lot to learn. Last week we began Mishnah number 1 of chapter 2, Pirkei Avos, where we're taught Rebbe Omer, Rebbe, otherwise known as Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, otherwise known as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, who was a tremendously important person in the development of Torah, and is somebody who was considered to be one of the greatest spiritual people of not only his time, but even the time that preceded him, and certainly the time that followed him. So he taught us as follows: Eizahi derech yeshara, what is the straight and upright path, sheyavor loy ha'adam, that a person should choose for themselves. And then he goes on to say, kol shehi tiferes loy service, tiferes loy mina adam. So we asked a few questions about that last week. What kind of a question is this? What is the derech yeshara sheyavor? What kind of a thing is this? That you should choose. You get to choose what the correct path is. Isn't that the whole purpose of Torah mitzvahs? The correct path is Torah mitzvahs. So that's what you should choose. You should choose to fulfill Torah mitzvahs. So I saw a beautiful insight, and it fits the flow of this Mishnah very well. And the insight is that sometimes people do things because they feel compelled to do them. This is the way I was brought up, this is the education that I received, this is the expectation that my family has of me, etc. So Rebbe says, Eizei derech yeshara. Of course you have to observe Judaism. That's not even a question. You have to observe Judaism. But the question is, Eizei derech yeshara sheyavor loy ha'adam. Out of all of the different ways in which a person can observe Judaism, the ultimate, the best, the greatest way to observe Judaism is when you choose it. Sheyavor loy. So in other words, you read it slightly differently. You read it, Eizei derech yeshara. What is the correct path? Sheyavor. The correct path is to choose. The correct way to observe Judaism is that you choose to do it, that you don't do things because you're compelled, and you don't do things just simply because that's how you were educated, but you actually consciously make the choice to do it. So that's one interpretation. Now, there's a problem with that. What's the problem? The problem is that as soon as you allow people to start to make their own choices, who's to guarantee that they'll make the right choices? Sometimes it's safer and easier to force people to have to toe the line. So as soon as he says, Eizei derech yeshara sheyavor loy ha'adam, what is the appropriate path that a person should choose? As soon as he indicates that there is a value to choosing, straight away he says, now you've got to be careful when you choose. Veheve mechashev schar mitzvah keneged hefseda schar hefsed mitzvah keneged schara schar avera keneged hefseda. So straight away, as soon as you're making the choice, we need to give you guidelines. What kind of thinking do you need to employ in order to make the right choices? So the kind of thinking that you have to make is, you have to decide in every decision that you're going to take, what is the short-term value, which is usually the wrong decision, if you're seeing only a short-term value versus the long-term potential loss, and what is the long-term value compared to a short-term loss. And so basically that's what he's telling us over here, that it's valuable to know how to make a choice of your own, how your Judaism should be yours. You should own it. You should relate to it in a personal way. I think it's quite relevant, by the way, now that we're in the month of Elul. And often, what happens to us in the month of Elul, because it's a time of introspection, everybody uses terms like teshuvah, and they tell us what we're supposed to be doing, and how we have to fix our act, and how we have to come closer to Hashem, etc., etc., etc. So one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to try and be like somebody else. You look around and you say, well, this person does X. Maybe in order for me to be aligned with what Hashem wants, I need to also do X. Now, of course, it's always valuable to role model. To look at other people and see what they're doing and to emulate what they're doing, especially if what they're doing is good. However, at the same time, you can't become somebody else. And that is quite tempting at times, that a person says, I would like to be somebody else. I may be a little bit dissatisfied with who I am, so let me try to be somebody else for a time. So therefore, sheyavo loy ha'adam has tremendous value, that a person needs to know who they are, and a person needs to work through things themselves, and our Judaism should be ours. It should be personal to us. It should be something of our choosing. It's interesting how often people come to Rabbonim. I don't think it's unique to me. People come over to rabbis and they say, I wish I could go through a conversion process. Why? Because they look around and they see people who were not born into Judaism and they take nothing for granted. And because they take nothing for granted, so therefore they learn and they discover elements of Yiddishkeit that you and I, who've been in this process and been in the system for the longest time, we don't necessarily know or think about these things because it just comes naturally to us. So sheyavo loy ha'adam, there is a value in a person choosing for themselves, not just to do what is Jewish because that's what we were told since the youngest age, but actually come to terms and to appreciate it for ourselves. Now, what is interesting over here also is that it then goes on to say that if you focus on three things, you will never do an Aveira. So last week we primarily invested our attention to the first part of the Mishnah. We spoke a lot about this concept of the path that you should choose for yourself and what is Derech Yeshara and the principle of Tiferes, why he specifically uses the expression Tiferes, the balance between having a Judaism that is both beneficial to yourself as the practitioner and has a powerful and valuable impact on others, which of course is a very important thing. So now let's look at the second part of the Mishnah, and the second two parts of the Mishnah. So what does he say? He says what appears to be a contradiction. We started to ask this question last week. It seems that there's a contradiction over here, because on the one hand he says you should be careful about a so-called minor mitzvah as you are careful about a so-called major mitzvah. So the minute he says that, it makes it sound like there is some kind of a hierarchy over here. Some mitzvahs are more major and some mitzvahs are less major. And then he says, because because you don't know the reward for a mitzvah. Okay, so we get it. So you don't know. You think that such and such a mitzvah is a minor mitzvah. For example, some of the commentaries say that when you do a mitzvah every day, you tend to believe that it's less important. When you have a mitzvah that comes around once a year, you tend to think that it is more important. So that's why, for example, as we get closer to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, people become very engaged with their Judaism, because in our minds, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur only come around once a year. Of course, they also carry very important and central themes of Judaism. So everybody rushes to get involved with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Whereas there are other mitzvahs that you do every single day. Who says they're such a big deal? I do them every single day. I'm kind of used to them. You take them almost for granted. So one of the things that he's telling us over here is, don't think for one moment that you could choose to say, this mitzvah to me is less important because to me this is a weekday mitzvah, a regular mitzvah. That mitzvah is a special mitzvah. Reminds me a little bit of a pretty well-known story. There was a fellow who was imprisoned, as was often the case for medieval Jews. He was imprisoned and he wasn't allowed to practice as a Jewish person in the prison system. However, they offered him that he could choose one day on the calendar. Any day that he chose, one day on the calendar that he would be allowed to practice as a Jewish person. Now, can you imagine the dilemma? Which day do you choose? Do you choose Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach? Which day? So he was very uncertain of what he should do, and he wrote a query to, at that time, a great sage called the Radvaz, Rabbi David ibn Zimra. He was a great halachic authority. So he asked him, if I'm given a choice, which day should I prioritize over all other days to be able to be Jewish? Now think about it for a second. What would you choose? Imagine you had this dilemma. Which day would you choose? We probably all have our personal favorite Yom Tov. Some people would have chosen Purim because it's a day they love absolutely. Some people would have chosen Yom Kippur because it's a day that we believe is just absolutely central to the whole of Judaism. Achas bashana, as the Torah says. It is once a year. This opportunity does not come around again, and we get to clear the slate. So anyhow, he wrote to the Radvaz. And the Radvaz replied to him, and it's one of the most insightful perspectives on how Judaism operates. So the Radvaz wrote to him that the day that you should choose to live as a full-fledged Jew, to be able to do all the mitzvahs that you want to do, should be today. The first day that you have that opportunity, grab it. Because you don't know. You don't know if your personal assessment of this mitzvah over that mitzvah is accurate. It's quite likely that there's something that you and I consider to be minor, which in Hashem's eyes could be absolutely major. So, as far as Rebbe is concerned, in that part of the Mishnah, he tells us, we don't know how to weigh up mitzvahs. You don't know the reward of mitzvahs. And then the very next statement that he makes seems to contradict that absolutely. Because the very next statement that he makes is, V'heve mechashev schar mitzvah keneged hefseda. You should calculate the reward of a mitzvah against the loss that might be incurred by trying to do the mitzvah, the financial loss, the time, the social impact, whatever the particular things are that people are always concerned about. So now hang on a second, Rebbe, we don't understand what's going on over here. One sentence ago you said, mitzvahs, that nobody knows the reward for a mitzvah. And now you're telling me that the correct way to determine how I should approach a mitzvah is to weigh up the reward against the potential loss. How do you reconcile the two? So last week we touched on one explanation. In short, we touched on the concept that there are many times in the Torah where it does not spell out for us what the reward is for a mitzvah. In fact, it almost never does. Whereas the consequences for an avera are spelled out. So perhaps what Rebbe is telling us over here is, when you know hefsed, when you understand what you stand to lose by transgressing, so relative to what you stand to lose, that will help you to appreciate what you stand to gain by doing the mitzvah. However, that's not really good enough, because he said you don't know the reward. So now make up your mind. Do you know the reward of a mitzvah, or don't you know the reward of a mitzvah? So there's something deeper going on over here, and we need to explore what it is. This is not only a principle about this particular Mishnah, this is actually a principle about the whole of Judaism. The whole of Judaism can be split into two channels. The channel that we do understand, and the channel that we don't understand. Or to put it into slightly different terms, the whole of existence, everything, not only mitzvahs, can be split into two realities. There's a reality called oir, light and energy, and there's a reality called keli, structure, or the direct translation, vessel. So the most obvious place to look at this is in ourselves. So you meet a person, you look at the person. What do you see when you look at a person? You see their features. You see their physical form. That is the most obvious keli. It's the structure of the person. Is that the person? When you meet somebody, you say, oh, so-and-so is this height. They've got that, shoulders like this color eyes. Is that the person? It's not the person. Years before, this person was not that tall. And they didn't have such broad shoulders. And in years to come, their hair will no longer be the same color, and they might shrink a little bit, and their body might shrivel a little bit. So is that the person? It's not the person. That's the keli. That is the current structure that represents the person in this world. So then you'll say, okay, you're right. You're right. The person is not their physical anatomy. But maybe the person is their personality, their character, because that certainly is what distinguishes one person from the next. For example, if you had to see identical twins. So identical twins, the physical form does not distinguish the one from the other. You look at them, you're scratching your head. Now, which one are you again? You hear many stories of identical twins and the kind of pranks that they were able to play, not only on their teachers at school, but sometimes even on their own parents. That's very much just keli. That's very much just the outer structure, the shell within which the person lives. If, God forbid, something devastating happens to that keli, to that structure, the person inside will still be intact. So you think, okay, well, maybe in that case, the real person is their personality or their character, because that's what distinguishes one person from the next. So you may have two people who are identical twins, and yet the one has a very, for argument's sake, outgoing, happy, bubbly kind of a personality, and the other one might have a very reserved personality. So there I can start to see the distinction Here's the one person and there's the other person. Only your personality and your character is another more subtle keli. It's the structure within which you live, because circumstantially a person's character could change. Something, God forbid, happens to a person and it scars them for life. And you look around and you say, I remember when that person was just so happy, so free. And now look at them. Everything is heavy and they've become so introverted and they become so sour. Not blaming them. These are their circumstances in life. Or alternatively, a much better example, more suited to the month of Elul, a person works on themselves and they change their character. So somebody who used to be so impatient, look at this, they've become tolerant. A person who would fly off the handle and easily lose their temper, look how calm they've become. Somebody who was so unmotivated, so lazy, and look at this, they found a way to be able to drive themselves. So it is possible for somebody's character or personality to modify and to change with time. So that is still not the person, that is the keli, it is the structure. It's a deeper, more personal version of the structure, but it's still the structure within which I live. So who's the person? Who is the real person? Their soul. Because a person's soul does not change. The person's experience of their own soul changes. During the course of life, a person could be more in touch with their soul or less in touch with their soul. But the soul is a constant. The soul is what we call the oir, the energy that vitalizes and empowers the keli, the structure. So two twins, both look identical. What makes this one behave that way and have that kind of character? What makes that one behave differently and have a different character? The soul. So the personality and the character is an expression of the soul. It's the structure within which the soul can express itself. It is not the soul. So every single thing that exists has what is called the or and the keli. It's got the structure and the life within the structure. So that was an easy example because we know about ourselves that we are body and soul. So it's quite easy to distinguish. Say the body is the keli, the structure. The soul is the or, the energy. The composite of the two together, that's me. The structure may and probably should change over time, and the energy should remain constant. Now let's use a different example just to illustrate a similar point. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you have a table, and that table is made out of wood. So the wood is the keli. The wood is the material, the matter from which this table was formed. However, wood could be all kinds of things. Some wood lands up being table. Other wood will become a door. Different wood will become a chair. Other wood will just become a pallet that's used in a factory. So wood is the material. That's what we call the choimer. It's the material of the object. Once it's made into a particular shape and form, now it has an or, it has an identity. It has an energy, so to speak, that is associated. This block of wood is no longer a block of wood. It is now alive, so to speak. It's alive as a piece of furniture. It lives as a table. Up until this point in time, it was not a table, it was just a block of wood. So every single thing has or and keli. It has structure and it has energy. Usually, we're pretty good at assessing the structure. So even this table, once it's now got the title table, right, it's still, at the end of the day, is also still a keli. What does that mean? You can measure it. This table is 2 meters long. It stands 1.2 meters off the ground. If I had to place it on a scale, it has a mass of X amount of kilos. So it's still, it's a keli in the sense that I can understand it, I can work it out. What's its function? The function is that you can put things onto that table. It might be a dining room table. How do you measure that? How do you measure if this table will be the table for happy occasions or if this will be the table for boardroom meetings? You can't measure that in the table. So you can place it in a particular room and say this is now in a boardroom. Or it is in a dining room, that you can do. But you can't measure what will the atmosphere be around this table. We don't know. You walk into a place and there's a massive table over there. Do you get the feeling of what kind of events have happened here? Well, you can guess. You can guess that this table happens to sit in a dining room, so I assume that what happens around this table is people gather and they eat. Fine. But can you tell, is the ambiance of that eating enjoyable? Is it happy? Are the people who sit at this table in a happy space? Is the association that they have for this table good memories? Or is this table a place where everybody comes and it's highly disciplined and you've got to sit in a particular way and mind your P's and Q's and tuck in your napkin and whatever the case is, and it's very rigid? You don't know by looking at the table. So the aura, the energy around it, I actually don't have the tools to be able to work out just by observing the table. So that's or and keli. Now, when it comes to mitzvahs, every mitzvah, like anything else that exists, has or and keli. There's the structure of the mitzvah, the keli of the mitzvah. There is the or of the mitzvah, the energy of the mitzvah. So, for example, let's say that there's a mitzvah, for argument's sake, because it's this time of the year, there's a mitzvah to blow the shofar. It's a mitzvah coming up on Rosh Hashanah. We have a mitzvah to blow the shofar. Now, currently, during the month of Elul, it's a custom to blow the shofar as well, just to get us into the mood. Wake us up. But on Rosh Hashanah, there is a mitzvah to blow the shofar. What is the keli? What is the structure of the mitzvah? It's simple. It's got to be on that particular day. This year, the first day of Rosh Hashanah is a Shabbos. You may not blow the shofar. I get it. I understand it. You're giving me the parameters, just like I can measure the dining room table, just like I can look at the structure of a person, see how tall they are, what color their eyes and hair are. So I look at this and I know the parameters. I may not blow the shofar on Shabbos. I know that a shofar has to be large enough that if I hold it in my hand, it will stick out on either side. I know that the shofar may not have certain kinds of cracks or holes. I know that it cannot be coated with a material that might alter the sound that comes out of the shofar. There's, of course, a raging debate at the moment about the suggestion to put a surgical mask over the shofar so as not to spread coronavirus when you blow it. It would seem that most halachic authorities believe that that is not problematic, but this is not a halacha shir, so consult your local Orthodox rabbi. So what do we know? We know that there are a certain amount of sounds that you have to make in order to fulfill the mitzvah of the shofar. We know that each sound has to be defined in a particular way. It's got to be this long, and you do breathe or you don't breathe, and you do have a break, you don't have a break. We know that you can't hear the shofar via anything else, so you can't hear the echo of a shofar, you can't hear it over a device. You have to actually hear it live. Okay, this is all the keli. This is the structure of the mitzvah. I can understand that. Can really 100% sit down, have a shiur, know exactly what it entails. I can even know why we blow a shofar. That also makes sense to me. Why do we blow a shofar? Because as the Rambam says, Uru Yeshenim Mishinachem, that it's a wake-up call. Just like Revelay, back in the army, when they would blow a trumpet and wake everybody up in the morning. This is a wake-up call. Anybody hears the shofar, Hayitoka shofar ba'ir va'am lo yechrado, as the pasuk says, is it possible that you could blow a shofar and people don't begin to tremble? We get it. We know it. We understand why we do this thing. We understand that blowing the shofar has the symbolism of coronation because Hashem is a king. And we have to coronate Hashem on Rosh Hashanah. So we get it. We understand it. Now, the oir, the real energy of the mitzvah of shofar, we actually have no clue about. As much as you'll learn, as much as you'll go to shiur after shiur, as much as you'll hear the shofar year after year, as much as will cause your spine to tingle, what we get to understand and to appreciate about a shofar, or for that matter, any other mitzvah, is the most superficial epidermis of the mitzvah. Why? What is a mitzvah? It's an important question to ask. What is a mitzvah? Some people will translate a mitzvah as a good deed, which is nice, but that's not a mitzvah, because many mitzvahs are not good deeds. Blowing the shofar is not a good deed. Unless, of course, you're blowing the shofar for somebody else who could not get to shul and was unable to hear, then it's a good deed. But when I hear the shofar, that's not a good deed. It's not making somebody else feel good. A good deed is having somebody over for a meal, visiting the sick, paying a shiva call, being nice, smiling and stuff. Those are good deeds. Mitzvahs are not good deeds. They are much more profound than good deeds. So what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah, the correct definition of a mitzvah is Ratzoin Hashem. This is what Hashem wants. That's the definition of a mitzvah. This is what Hashem wants. Do I know why He wants it? I don't. Do I understand what His goal for it is? I don't. He lets me have a little glimpse to say there are these following benefits. The shofar will wake you up, it will inspire you, it will prepare you for Rosh Hashanah. All these are side benefits. But that's not the real value of the mitzvah. The real value, it's what Hashem wants. And if Hashem wants something, that is absolute value. I don't need any other explanations. I don't need any other layers. Now we'll know from our own experience that sometimes when you really want something very deeply, you're unable to explain why. Certain things you can explain. You can justify. I need this for this particular purpose. I want that because it will make me feel X, or it will do this or whatever in my life. But when I really want something from the depths of my being, I may not be able to put it into words. It might be something that is so personal, so deep, that if I tried to explain it, it would rob the experience of its power. Explain to me, why does a person get nachas from their child? Okay, nachas is not exactly the same as what we're talking about. We're talking about will, but just to illustrate the point. Why do you get nachas from your child? It's ridiculous if I have to start to explain it. There's so much oil, there's so much power, there's so much energy, there's so much light, I cannot fit it into the structure of Kalim to say, this is the explanation, this is the purpose, this is the definition. It's beyond that. When it comes to doing mitzvahs, every single time that we do a mitzvah, we engage with Hashem through the mitzvah at two levels, because there are two channels of Judaism. That which we can understand and that which we cannot understand. The advantage of the part of Judaism that we do understand is it fits nicely, it sits well. I feel I connect with this, I resonate with this, it makes sense. I don't feel like I'm some kind of a meshugana. So that's great. That's wonderful. It's good for me. There's a downside, because what I am capable of understanding is always going to be finite, not because I have my limitations, because the process called understanding is a finite process. And Hashem is infinite. So there's another whole channel to the mitzvah. There's another dimension to the mitzvah, which is I'm connecting to Hashem beyond what I understand. So there's the keli of the mitzvah, there's the part of the mitzvah that I can relate to, that speaks to me. I can fit it into the structures of my mind and my heart, and it resonates. And then there's another entire dimension of the mitzvah which is absolutely beyond me. The part that I can understand and appreciate, that's the part of the mitzvah experience that I am required to explore and to study and to meditate on, because it is that important to resonate. And the part of the mitzvah that is absolutely beyond me, the part of the mitzvah that is, so to speak, on Hashem's terms, what Hashem wants out of the mitzvah, that part I can never understand. So how do I commit to that part of the mitzvah? I do it with absolute faith and acceptance. Says Rebbe, there are two processes. Process number one, the bedrock of all Judaism, is have a zoyer b'mitzvah kala k'vachamura, that you need to be as dedicated to the so-called simple mitzvah as you are to the so-called major mitzvah. Why would you be as dedicated? Because you recognize that the primary channel of mitzvahs is, it's what Hashem wants, not what I think. So I have a hierarchy in my mind. More important mitzvahs, less important mitzvahs. But the key to being a Jew, the key to mitzvah observance is push that out. Step number one is I do what Hashem wants because it is what Hashem wants, Ein ata, you, the person, the human mind cannot know matan schoren shel mitzvah, the real value of a mitzvah. It's not possible. So therefore, rather than trying to construct a version in my head, accept that whatever Hashem says goes. Big things, small things. It's not for me to choose. It's not for me to start to define my own version of religion. I think that's an important mitzvah and that's not an important mitzvah. If that's the case, I've reduced the whole of Judaism to my terms. And Judaism is a gift to connect to Hashem on His terms. So therefore, the first principle you have to know is you don't know the real reward. The real reward is not something you get. It's not something you learn. It's not something you experience. It's the fact that you're connected to what Hashem wants. That's the real reward. And that's completely beyond human understanding or any understanding for that matter. Now that you have that principle, don't become lazy and say, well, in that case, I'm just going to do whatever Hashem says without asking any questions. No. Have a mechashev. Then there's another channel of connection, which is to the best of my ability, I should try and understand. So I need to accept that at the core of Judaism, it's beyond what I will ever understand, but that does not give me license not to learn and probe to the extent that Hashem allows me to understand. So lesson number 1 is I will never know the true value of a mitzvah because it is infinite. Lesson number 2, and yet I have to do my level best to understand as best as human capacity will allow. Weigh up mitzvah against loss, against reward. Now, after that, after he's told us this incredible principle, which is really, one of these things, there's certain principles in Torah that totally shift your perspective. This is one of them. Totally shifts our perspective on what Torah and mitzvahs are about and how we should approach them. Then he says, "Histakel b'shloisha devarim," focus on 3 things and you won't sin. What are the 3 things? Ayin roy avos and shamas. It says first, know that which is above you, principle number 1. Principle number 2, ayin roy avos and shamas. There's an eye that sees everything and an ear that hears everything. Principle number 3, all of your actions will be recorded for posterity. So what's it telling us? Basically, that Hashem knows everything and He never forgets. So if you recognize that, you'll never do anything wrong because you'll always be on record and you'll know that Hashem will never miss a beat. Now, we're still going to learn later in chapter 3 that there's another opinion about the 3 things you should focus on in order not to sin. Rebbe is telling us focus on these 3 things in order not to sin. And in chapter 3, we'll have a person called Akavya ben Mahalalel, who actually came before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And he says, Histakel b'shloisha devarim, focus on 3 things and you'll never sin. And I did tell you last week that when we get, please God, to that Mishnah, we'll talk about why the number 3 is so relevant. We're not going to do that right now. There in chapter 3, Akavya ben Mahalalel says that the 3 things to focus on which will keep you from sin is that you come from very, very humble beginnings, that at the end of life, everything just decomposes, and that you'll have to stand in front of Hashem and give an accounting for your life. In other words, Akavya ben Mahalalel focuses that the 3 meditations to keep you from sin are all about human weakness. You come from nowhere, you're going nowhere, and you will be accountable. Rebbe in this Mishnah says that the 3 things that you're supposed to focus on are all about divine greatness. So you get 2 choices. Do you keep yourself from sinning by thinking about your own weakness, Akavya ben Mahalalel's approach? Or do you keep yourself from sinning by focusing on Hashem's greatness, Rebbe's approach? Because there are 2 different approaches, that's why Rebbe says at the beginning of this Mishnah, which is the better path, which is the upright path that a person should choose. If you have a choice, should you focus on how poor your performance is in order to keep yourself on the straight and narrow? So there's a school of thought that says, yes, that's how you should do it. That our focus should always be beat ourselves up. I'm a failure, I've done this wrong, I'm out of touch, I come from nowhere, I'm going nowhere, and that will humble us to the point that we do what Hashem wants. There's an alternative. Focus on Hashem's greatness. Hashem is always there. He's always above us. He's always keeping an eye. He'll never forget. Rebbe is of the view that we should rather focus on Hashem's greatness to keep us from sin, rather than to emphasize our own failing to keep us from sin. And that's why he says it is derech yeshara. Out of the two choices, this is the derech yeshara. This is the better path. Out of the choices available, this is the better path. So what's he telling us to focus on? Dam alamayla mimoch, know that which is above you. What is above you? Ayin roivos and shamas. There's an eye that sees everything and an ear that hears everything. Let's think for a minute. What does that mean? An eye that sees everything. So, okay, on the face of it, most people will tell you it's like some major network of CCTV cameras, or it's like Google tracking your every move through your phone. And he knows exactly where you're going and what you're up to. Knows what you're doing. He sees everything. But there's a pasuk that says that Hashem yireh lelevav. Unlike human beings who are only able to see what the eye can see, Hashem can see into our hearts. When we talk about an eye that can see, we're not just talking about the fact that Hashem is able to track every one of our activities. Something a lot more profound than that. It means that Hashem is able to see our intentions. Very often, we judge ourselves or others by the things that we do because we're oblivious to the thought process behind it. So, because we can't see what a person is thinking, we can only really assess them based on how they behave. But Hashem, ayin roya, the eye that Hashem has that sees, as the pasuk in Tehillim says, ein Hashem el yireyav. Hashem's eye is to those who fear Him. That's internal. We don't know if another person fears God or not. We know if they do what God says. We don't know if they fear God. So Hashem's eye sees the thoughts that we have. And Hashem's eye sees the intentions that we have. Oizen shoyma'as. Hashem hears the words that we say. Because a human being primarily acts in three areas: thought, speech, and action. We hope that nobody knows what we really think. A lot of the stuff that goes on in our minds, not for public consumption. So what does he tell us? Hashem's eye sees what we think. And his ear hears what we say. But v'chol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavim, he only records what translates into action. There's a relief. There's a relief. It is acceptable for a person to have inappropriate thoughts from time to time. It's not acceptable to entertain them, but it's acceptable that they happen. We have temptations. We have negative thoughts. They pop into our heads. Question is whether we act on them or not. In the seminal work of Tanya, which is the core of all Chabad Hasidic philosophy, so he talks a lot about this concept, that the objective for us, we're not tzaddikim, we're not the super righteous individuals of the community. We're, so to speak, ordinary Jews. So the objective for us is not to allow those thoughts that pop up into our heads to stay. And certainly not to act on them. Here you have an endorsement for that. What's recorded in the book? Not your thoughts. Not even the words that you say, unless of course they are words that the Torah says clearly you're not allowed to say, like Lashon Hora. But the primary thing is how you act. A person should never destroy their own self-image based on the thoughts that swirl in their heads, as long as we know how to control and quarantine them, to use a popular term in today's world, and to get rid of them. We cannot be blamed for the fact that they popped in. Now, one of the most profound things that he tells us over here in this Mishnah is Da malamayla mimach. Know that which is above you. You know, sometimes you go into a shul and they have on the podium where the chazan davens, they have a cloth that has embroidered on it, Da lifnei mi ata oimed. Know in front of whom you stand. Likewise, in the Shulchan Aruch, right in the beginning of the Code of Jewish Law, it says, Shivisi Hashem lenegdi samid, that one of the core principles of a Jewish person is that I should have Hashem in front of me at all times. So we know this. It's not something that's new. It's not something that is unique to Pirkei Avos. It's brought in various places. Shavisi Hashem Disam is a pasuk in Tehillim. There are various places that tell us we should have a consciousness of Hashem at all times and in all places. Over here, he tells us something a little more nuanced. You should know, Lemaila mimoch, that which is above you. Now, literally, if you read it at face value, he's telling us you should be aware of the fact that Hashem is above you. But there's a saying from the Baal Shem Tov that you punctuate this just slightly differently. What you need to know is as follows. Lemaila, the things that happen on high, the attitude that Hashem takes towards us, the flow of energy from Hashem to us, all of that is mimoch. It comes from you. We have a principle in Judaism which is called midah keneged midah, that Hashem deals with us in line with the way we behave. So maila, whatever goes on in the upper realms, mimoch is the product of our choices and our behavior. Seeing as Rebbe wants to tell us over here that there's a methodology we're supposed to focus on in order to stay away from sin, this is incredibly powerful. How does a person keep themselves from sin when you recognize that the things that we do here are going to be things that have an impact on the spiritual flow that comes into our lives from on high? One last point, it is a big subject, way beyond the scope of this, not only the shir, but the series, is you'll notice that he says, Kol ma'asecha b'sefer nichtavim. For those people who know Hebrew grammar, the expression nichtavim makes it sound like it happens almost automatically. It doesn't say Hashem writes your deeds in a book. It says the deeds are written. It's in the passive voice. Are written. Why is that? Because he's just made a big statement that Hashem knows everything. He knows what you're doing. He knows what's happening. It brings up one of the most profound and important subjects that is often debated in philosophy and theology, and that is, if Hashem knows, how do we have free choice? He knows exactly what's going to happen. Not only does he know what is happening, but he knows what's going to happen. So how do we have the choice then? Either he knows, like the Rambam says, either he knows exactly what's going to happen, or if you suggest we have free choice, that implies that perhaps he doesn't really know for sure what's going to happen. How do you reconcile the two? Here, Rebbe alludes to it. Nichtavim, it's in the passive voice. Sometimes when you know something, it actually has an effect on what's going to happen next. And other times when you know something, it has no effect on what's going to happen next. So for example, if I had to take a child, my child, and I had to put in front of them a choice between a salad or a chocolate cake, and I know that they're going to choose the chocolate cake, my knowledge is passive. It doesn't actually influence their decision. It's just because I know them well enough. And so Rebbe wants to allude to that by saying, B'sefer nichtavim, it's a passive record of our behavior. Because Hashem's recording of our behavior does not influence our behavior. Like I say, it's a very big topic. It's something we could explore in a tremendous amount of detail, which we're not going to do now. But I think everybody will agree that this particular Mishnah has some of the most incredibly foundational principles of how a Jewish person is supposed to think. Choose a path of Yiddishkeit that is good for us and good for others. Recognize that ultimately we don't really begin to understand the value of a mitzvah, and yet we have to try to the best of our abilities. Be aware of the fact that everything we do is recorded, and everything that we do has a direct impact on what will come back to us from on high.